Today we're going to take it one step further with factoring trinomials. Today there is going to be a GCF that we need to factor out first before we are able to factor out the trinomial completely. So I want to do a quick recap just with a binomial of how to factor out a GCF. This is something that I covered with you, or we covered with you a couple weeks ago. So if you do not remember how to factor out a GCF, I would go back and rewatch that video first and then come visit today's information. So the first example here is 5x minus 35. We're going to look at this one first. So what you want to do is figure out what is the greatest common factor between 5 and 35. Hopefully at this point you can figure out that that would be a 5. And then remember, to figure out what's left over, you divide every term by that GCF. So 5x divided by 5 is x. Negative 35 divided by 5 is negative 7. So that's how you would factor out a GCF. The second example we have here is negative 3x squared plus 27x. Now you may remember me saying that you always want your leading coefficient to be positive. So because right now my leading coefficient is negative 3, I know I'm going to have to factor out a negative. The GCF of 3 and 27 is 3, so I'm going to factor that out. And both of these terms actually have an x, so I'm also going to factor an x out. So to figure out what is left over, you divide every single term by negative 3x. Negative 3x. So negative 3 divided by negative 3 is just 1. X squared divided by x is x. 27 divided by negative 3 is negative 9. X divided by x is just 1, so we don't have anything else left over there. So that is what that binomial would look like when your GCF is factored out. Moving on to some trinomials. Here we have negative x squared minus 4x plus 21. So if you are looking at your A, B, and C, this is in standard form. So my A is negative 1, my B is negative 4, and my C is 21. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out, okay, what is the GCF of these three things? Well, 1 is a prime number, or excuse me, 1 is not a prime number, but the leading coefficient is negative 1. We always want that leading coefficient to be positive, so I know that I need to pull out a negative. If I think about 1, 4, and 21, they have nothing in common, so that just means my GCF is going to be negative 1. So I'm going to pull out a negative 1, and I'm going to write what is left. So again, to figure out what is left, you're going to divide every single term by that GCF, which means I'm dividing every single one of these by negative 1. So negative x squared divided by negative 1 will make that a positive x squared. Negative 4x divided by negative 1 will make that a positive 4x. And 21 divided by negative 1 will make that a negative 21. Now from here, you can choose whether you want to do method 1 or method 2 from the video earlier this week. Completely up to you. Regardless of which method you are choosing, I'll show you both of them just to make sure you remember them. Method number 1, you are going to multiply to your constant term, which is this guy. Get a different color. So this guy we want to multiply to negative 21, and we want to add to positive 4. Okay, so hopefully we know that 7 times 3 is 21. One of those numbers needs to be negative in order to make it a negative 21. So when we factor this up, we just have to say, okay, I know that 7 and 3 give me 21. In order to add up to a positive 4, I need this 7 to be positive. And again, if you're still stuck with that, go back and rewatch the video from Monday or Tuesday. Now, we did have this GCF, which we pulled out. The most important thing to remember is that that GCF needs to come down all the way out front when you write your factors. Method number 2 is the x method. So again, the top part of that x is a times c, so 1 times negative 21 is negative 21. b for the bottom, so the bottom is your b, which is 4. The sides are always over a, which again, for all our purposes right now, is always going to be 1. We talked about how 7 times negative 3 gives us negative 21, and 7 plus negative 3 gives us 4. So our factors, remember it's 1x, which we can write just as x. The numerator was positive 7, so plus 7. On the right-hand side here, we have 1x, which again we can write just as x. Numerator was negative 1, so minus 3. And again, we had that GCF of negative 1, so that has to come down out front. And again, you can FOIL all that back out, just 3 root the negative 1. You should end up with what you started with. Another example we have here is 3x squared minus 15x plus 18. This is in standard form. If you look at your exponents, they are in order from greatest to least. And your leading coefficient is positive, so that's a good thing. So what I need to do is I'm going to identify A as 3, B as negative 15, and C as 18. And what I'm going to do is I need to find the GCF between all 3 of those numbers. You should find that to be 3, which means you're going to be dividing every single term here by 3. So I'm pulling out that 3, and I'll be left with 3 divided by 3 is 1, so that'll just be 1x squared or x squared. Negative 15 divided by 3 is negative 5. Carry along the x, and 18 divided by 3 is 6. So again, regardless of what method you choose, you should end up with the same factors. So I would go ahead and pause this now. See if you can find the factors for just this inside piece. So you can either choose method 1 or method 2. Pause it, figure out what the factors are, and then come back and see if you are correct. Okay, so regardless of what method you chose, hopefully you were able to find that your factors should be x minus 2 and x minus 3, because negative 2 times negative 3 does give us positive 6, which is what we had to multiply to. And negative 2 plus negative 3 does give us negative 5, which is what you had to add to. Again, your GCF was 3, so we bring that down, and that would be our final answer. And I have one more example for you. Again, first things first, make sure you are in standard form. We have negative 2x to the third minus 6x squared plus 56x. So again, we can see that it is in standard form, but my leading coefficient is not 1. So I need to go through and I need to see what my GCF is between negative 2, negative 6, and 56. And anytime you have a negative number out front, that is a major hint to you that you are going to be pulling out a negative number. Okay, so I know it has to be negative. Between 2, 6, and 56, 2 is the greatest common factor between them, which means I'm going to be dividing all of these guys by negative 2. But if you look at all of these terms, notice that this is x to the third. We're used to having x to the second. This one in the middle is x to the second. We're used to just having x. And this one is x, where we're used to not having any variable at all. So since they all have one of those x's in common, we're going to put an x on this GCF also. Okay, so my GCF is negative 2x, and then we're going to say what is left over. So if I do negative 2 divided by negative 2, they cancel. X to the third divided by x is x to the second. That looks a little bit more like what we're used to. Negative 6 divided by negative 2 is positive 3. X squared divided by x is x. Again, that looks a little bit more like what we are used to seeing in a trinomial. And for our last one, 56 divided by negative 2 is negative 28. X divided by x, well, that cancels, so there are no x's. Okay, so now this does look a little bit more like what we're used to seeing. So you're going to take a minute. Again, feel free to pause the video, method 1, method 2, whatever works best for you, and factor this trinomial. Come back, see if you get it correctly. Okay, so hopefully you were able to see that this should factor out to x plus 7 and x minus 4, because 7 times negative 4 is negative 28, and 7 plus negative 4 is positive 3. Again, this GCF needs to come down and get tagged along out front so that this should be your final factored answer. If you're still struggling with this, again, I would invite you to go back and re-watch the videos on how to factor out a GCF. And I would also encourage you to re-watch the videos from Monday and Tuesday about factoring a trinomial. As always, feel free to reach out to us. Hope you guys are doing well.